Okay, we've defined leadership. We're going to talk about some leadership qualifications now. And you can look at qualifications for a leader, and they fall into sort of three different areas, or I like to think of it as sort of three different buckets. And those buckets are relationship, character, and competence. So, sort of some general comments first. Who puts leaders in their position? God does. Romans 13:1 says, "Let every soul be subject unto higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." So God's the one that puts a leader in a position. And if that leader's in there and God will use them to carry out His objectives, then it may be a godly or may be an ungodly leader. This is a sobering thought. Leaders must meet a higher standard because of the responsibility of their position. This may discourage some people from being a leader, but if you're going to be a leader, you're going to be held to a higher standard than the followers. Leaders receive greater punishment and rewards because of the responsibility of their positions. Example of that is David over in 2 Samuel. You remember David numbered the people, and God says you're not supposed to number the people. David made that choice and he numbered the people, but who bore the consequences of that? The followers. You might not remember, but God said, I'm going to give you three choices. Because you numbered the people and were disobedient, you can have 7 years of famine, you can have 3 months of running from your enemy, or 3 days of pestilence. And so David chose the 3 days of pestilence, and 70,000 people died because of the choice of the leader. A common theme in God's selection of leaders is choosing people who walk closely with Him and who are upright in their character. I had an opportunity a number of years ago. Have you ever flown Southwest Airlines? You know, if you get past the cattle call of getting on board. But generally, the people that work for Southwest Airlines are upbeat. I mean, just go through the terminal and look at the different agents, and you get to Southwest, and boy, they're usually having a blast, and the people they're relating to are having a blast. How do you do that? Well, I spent a day at their University of People. In other words, it's their training center, and it's at Love Field in Dallas. And one thing I learned is that when they choose people, when they hire people, they hire for attitude and train for skill. What is the hardest to change in a person? The skill level or their attitude? Their attitude. And so why? That's important. When God looks for a leader, He's looking for character. Now let's look at some of these qualifications. This first relationship bucket, I call it, of relationship. The most successful leaders are those God calls and places in a position of leadership through His active will, rather than those leaders who actively seek a position of leadership. A.W. Tozer makes a statement, "A true and safe leader is likely to be one who has no desire to lead, but is forced into a position by the inward pressure of the Holy Spirit and the force of circumstances." So let leadership position seek you rather than you seeking a position. That's important. Look at the leaders. Did Moses go seeking that leadership position? Did Paul go seeking that leadership position? Did David? What about the disciples? All of them did not seek the position, but the position came seeking them. Think maybe we've got things messed up with our elected officials? We spend millions of dollars just let me in that position. This is what I found in the corporate world too, is that you prepare, but the positions will seek you. You have to be God called. Second is love. Have you ever noticed this? Some people aren't lovable. Have you ever had people in your corporation, in your group, small group at church, a member as a pastor, that we're just not lovable? As a leader, how are you going to love that person? It comes from what it says in Deuteronomy. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might. Write this down. It's in your book. Love for God precedes love for followers, and love for followers precedes leadership. Leaders have to love the people they lead. And when you come up against the fact that some people aren't lovable, the only way you can love them is to allow God to love them through you. And that's what you have to do. You love them through God. Obedience. I've seen a lot of people that want to be a leader, but they don't want to be a follower. To be a good leader, you must be a good follower. You've got to learn. It's mandatory. You remember Saul? Again, Saul didn't go seeking the position of king, but he became king. And then when he became king, he became rather arrogant about it, and he became disobedient. And what happened to Saul when Saul became disobedient? God removed him. So you've got to have obedience and then trust. A leader must have an unwavering trust in God to be used to the fullest. You remember Abraham? God promised him a son. He got a son in his late years. God said, oh yeah, by the way, I want you to sacrifice that son to me. Abraham did that, right? He went and was obedient to God. If you're going to be a leader, it requires a trust in God, because God's going to ask you to do things at times that you don't understand. But it takes that trust. It takes that trust in God. Now let's look at some character qualifications. When you think about the relationship, those relationship factors impact the leader's relation with God. But this character, that's what impacts your relationship with the followers. What's the first characteristic of character? It's integrity. And what's integrity? Personal integrity is a firm attachment to moral principles, honesty and sincerity, uprightness, and is characterized by consistent behavior. It's the basic element of character. General Norman Schwarzkopf, who led Desert Storm, made this statement: leadership is a potential combination of strategy and character. But if you must be without one, be without strategy. You've got to have character. You've got to have integrity. It's an absolute must. If you're ever going to get to the heart level with people, you're going to have integrity. And what does integrity sort of look like? Well, in 2 Peter, the Bible uses the term blameless and promises wisdom for the person of integrity. So, sometimes it's sort of hard to define integrity, but you know it when you see it, and you see it lacking, and you see that too, right? Corporation that I was a member of for a number of years had a CEO who was a man who did not have integrity. And after a period of time, the board replaced him and replaced him with another gentleman who was a man of integrity. And it made all the difference in that corporation, night and day, with a man of integrity. A study that's been done in leadership, the number one qualification cited for a leader by both employees and CEOs is personal integrity. Integrity is who a leader is. It's demonstrated by the alignment of a leader's values, words, and actions. Now, what does that mean? This gets down to the nitty-gritty. This is where the rubber meets the road. If a leader is going to have integrity, a leader is going to have to say what they're going to do and do what they say. How often? Every time. That's what integrity is about. What happens if you say what you're going to do and you don't do it? How does that affect your integrity? It starts to put a question mark there, doesn't it? That's why with young leaders, what I always encourage them is to underpromise and overdeliver. Because so frequently you can get enthused about something and make a commitment and not carry through. And this is every area. This is with your finances. This is with, how you treat your family. This is every area. You say what you're going to do what you say every time. Our pastor uses this example. It's a great example. Talking about fidelity in marriage. What if you made a statement to your spouse that I am faithful to you 364 days a year? Take that home and see how that flies. In other words, there's one day that I may not be faithful to you. So you see, with a leader, and I've seen so many leaders, whether it's in a financial area or maybe making promises that they don't keep. Now, I'm not saying that there are situations where you make a promise and maybe you can't keep it. But in a situation where you can't keep a promise, what should you do? You should go to that person and tell them you need to let them know. And then if you can, let them know why, and then let them know how you're going to correct that. It's not whether we make a mistake or not, folks. It's how we respond after we make a mistake. Do you know that some corporations actually can get an increase in customer satisfaction by how they recover from a mistake? I know there was one cable company that was located in Jackson, Mississippi, and what they would do, this is when they first started making commitments that I'll be there between these hours, and if they missed it, they would have that serviceman, particularly if it was a home with a woman in it, they would take a rose and say, we're sorry we missed, but we're here now, and will you take this as a show of good faith? And what they found was that they got an increase in customer satisfaction. So you can recoup from mistakes. Wisdom. Have you ever seen somebody that was educated beyond their intelligence? Typically, this applies to people that know a lot, but they don't know what to do with it. This is the difference. Difference between wisdom and knowledge, folks, is this. Wisdom is knowing how to apply the knowledge. And you can have 10 years of experience or 1 year of experience 10 times. What makes the difference is how you recoup from your mistakes. Don't keep making the same mistake. Wisdom, know how to apply. These are qualifications that God gave when they were choosing deacons. Discipline. Before a leader can discipline or train anyone else, he must himself be disciplined. Now, when I say discipline, a lot of people jump to that means punishment or correcting. Discipline, if you look at the word, it comes from saving of the mind, and it's really a whole process of teaching, training, and coaching. And it's negative and positive consequences. But if a leader is going to train and discipline other people, they have to be disciplined themselves. Let me give you an example of that in the family. When I teach on parenting, one thing I tell parents, and they don't like to hear this, and that is, if you're going to discipline your children, you must be disciplined yourself. What does that mean? That means if you're going to set expectations for your kids, and you're going to follow up on it, and you're going to give them positive or negative consequences, that means you're going to have to be disciplined enough to do it every time. So as a leader, you've got to be disciplined. What about moral purity? You've seen horrible examples of that. Typically, we think of in the area of sexuality, but it could be moral purity in any area. I've seen people throw their careers away in corporations. You've seen people in ministry throw their careers away because of a moral failure. That's part of the character. And courage. When God chose Joshua to lead the conquest, He told Joshua time after time, be of good courage, be strong. In Joshua chapter 1, verse 6, it says, be strong and of good courage, for unto this people shalt thou divide for an inheritance the land which I swear unto their fathers to give them. Now, what is courage? Is courage being fearless? Courage is not being fearless. Courage is, in the spite of fear, being willing to do what's right. In fact, courage cannot exist in the absence of fear. If you're not afraid of something, does it take much courage? No. But if there's fear, then that's courage. It's sort of like faith. You want to say, oh Lord, show me this and I'll have faith? Faith can only exist in the presence of uncertainty. And so courage can only exist in the face of fear. Leaders are going to be fearful. There's going to be times when, God, this is what you told me to do, but And that's not just in the church world, that's in the corporate world, and that's in every other organization. Now, competence. Do you think an expectation of followers for a leader is competence? This goes back to moving from the hand to the head. In other words, making the right decisions. Knowledge. Competence comes from a solid understanding of the business. In other words, there's some stuff you have to know. Not only about what your work is or your career is, whether it's ministry or corporate world, but here you need to know some principles on leadership. And I commend you for wanting to know what those are. When do you stop learning? I had a guy that worked for me once. He said, I've got 2 degrees and I don't want to learn anything else. And as you might suspect, he didn't rise very high in the organization because he knew everything he wanted to know. You've got to keep learning all the time. In fact, in 2 Timothy, this is what Paul told Timothy. Study to show thyself approved unto God. Skill. Proverbs 22:29. Seest thou a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings. He shall not stand before mean or average men. So leadership, again, I want to emphasize, is a learned skill. So you learn those skills. Experience. Successful leadership does not come overnight. How long did we say Moses trained? He really trained 80 years. What about Daniel? Daniel trained for a long time, but he was in leadership in the Babylonian Persian Empire for 70 years. I'll make a statement. You may disagree with me. That's okay. But my statement is this: there are no outstanding young leaders. Say, what? Are they not qualified? Yeah. Are they not skilled? Yes. But they haven't experienced some things. In fact, outstanding leadership. I mean, look at the leaders that down through history. I mean, they've generally been after tried in a lot of experiences. And experience is what? A function of birthdays. I've had young people, in an organization say, "Oh man, I want to do this or I want to do that." I said, "Great. Start here." "I don't want to do that. I want to jump up here and do that." You don't have the experience. Let me give you some experience, and then I'll put you up in that position. So it takes experience. Success. Write this one down. People will not follow failures. You can be a great leader. You can have the heart. You can even make some good decisions. But if you're not successful as a leader, people aren't going to follow you. And how do you get success? You earn it, right? Let me give you an illustration. And I've heard, some people in ministry say, "Well, I don't want to be a pastor. I tried that and it didn't work out, so I want to be a missionary." Okay. You see, you have to be successful and build on successes. You just don't jump into it. It's got to be. Now, let me give you a few promises. I want you to think about these things because when God called you, you're gonna need some promises. Look at these promises. When God called Joshua, He said, "There shall not any man be able to stand before thee." Look at Moses, and he said, "Certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee." What about David? "And I have been with thee whithersoever thou hast walked." Look at the promises God's making to Solomon. "Because this was in thine heart, and thou hast not asked riches, wealth, or honor, nor the life of thine enemies, neither yet hast asked long life, but hast asked wisdom and knowledge for thyself, thou mayest judge my people." So God makes these. What did He tell Paul? He says, "Paul, you're my chosen vessel." So you see, leaders, when God calls leaders, He makes certain promises to them. Now, when God makes promises, does He give anything to go along with those promises? What He gives is the power. Understand this. To be the leader that God wants you to be, it takes supernatural power. You cannot be the leader in your own strength that God expects you to be. And I'm not just talking about on the mission field or pastoring a church. I'm talking about in the corporate world. You can't be the leader that God expects you to be in your own strength. It's supernatural power. And so what does God promise us? He promises us that supernatural power. Supernatural power is promised to leaders, but it's not automatic. And what is it based on? Obedience. To receive God's power, you've got to be obedient. It's A leader must do it his way, not our way. God talked to Joshua in Joshua 1:7. It says, be strong and courageous, but you've got to be obedient. It requires this knowledge that we talked about. Joshua 1:8, one of my favorite verses, says, this book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then shalt have good success. So to receive supernatural power, you have to have the knowledge. Intimacy with God. This is one area that a lot of leaders unintentionally leave out. Intimacy with God. Why? Because they get so busy ministering to people, or maybe it's in a corporation, taking care of company business. Maybe it's in a classroom, taking care of students, that what gets pushed out is that quiet and private time with God. And how does that show up? You start to lose your power. Can I give you an illustration of that? Now, guys, let me tell you this first. Real men will vacuum floors. Okay? Now, if you've ever done much vacuuming, one thing that you've noticed is what? The cord is never long enough, right? You plug it in and you start vacuuming, and you need just a little more, but the cord won't reach. So you have some options. Namely the one if it's a guy we don't take, and that is stop, go unplug it, move it to a closer plug, and keep vacuuming. So what do? Pull, and the cord comes out, and you keep vacuuming. And all of a sudden you realize, I'm just going through the motions, and it's not doing any good. Now, as a leader, when you lose that intimacy with God, and for leaders, even in ministry, even as a pastor, as a missionary, you can get so busy doing good things that you lose that intimacy with God. And when you do that, you're vacuuming and the cord's unplugged. So what's the solution? Go plug it back in, right? Take the time that's necessary. Christ Himself maintained a daily intimate relationship with His Father. Supernatural power was similarly a requirement for the selection of leaders and deacons. Leadership power is not to be abused. It's so often, we'll talk about this a little more later, leadership can be intoxicating. It truly can. And you see this all the time, particularly if you follow the secular model of leadership rather than the biblical model, and you lose sight of the fact that I'm in a position of leadership for the benefit of these people rather than I'm in a position of leadership for me. And it's abused. There's a tremendous example over in Joshua. Now, Joshua had already been told by God, be courageous, be strong. And they were getting ready to attack Jericho, really the first encounter in the Promised Land. And so Joshua goes and he scouts out. And on his way to scout out, he sees, he's not sure what it is. It's actually an angel with a drawn sword. And I love this verse because Joshua says, whose side are you on? Are you on our side or their side? And do you know what the angel says? I'm on God's side. In other words, Joshua, I'm not on your side or their side. I'm on God's side. See, the point as a leader is it's not who's on our side, it's are we on God's side. Sometimes you're going to be in the minority as a leader to be on God's side. I found myself in the minority in the corporate world being on God's side. But the other side of that is we can abuse. We can. Have you ever heard anybody make this statement? I know I'm right because God's on my side. Ooh, I hate to hear that. And you know, I mean, it's like, maybe he is and maybe he's not. But the point is, you need to be on his side and not abuse it. So, we've talked about a lot of things in these first two sessions. We've talked about the purpose of leadership. We've defined leadership. We've talked about some misconceptions or some myths in leadership. And then we've sort of talked in this session about some promises that God makes. And we've talked about the power that He gives us, but it's conditional. That is, if we're on His side, not our side. And so, in our next session, we're going to start digging a little deeper because these things are true. But where the rubber meets the road is how do you do some of these things? That's what's important. And my background educationally is I'm an engineer. I tell folks that I'm an engineer that went bad and went into ministry. But see, that affects how I teach and how I see things. Because it's good to know what the Word says. But you know what I find? I find that most people know more Bible than they know how to apply. That's right. They don't know how to apply it. And I find it interesting that some of the Sunday school and Bible school songs we've never learned. You remember a song you used to sing? The wise man built his house upon the rock. Have you ever really looked at that parable? Really studied it? That parable says this: there were two men, a wise man and a foolish man. And they had some things in common, but then there's something that they were different in. Common was they both heard Christ said, this wise man and rich and foolish man built their house on a rock. They both built a house, one on the house, one on the sand. And it's not if the trouble comes, it says, and when. So, as a leader, you building on the rock, building on the sand, because trouble's going to come. But then the parable goes on and says that they both heard the word, one did it and one didn't. So here's the point. We need to know what the Bible says about every area of our life, particularly as leaders, what it says about leadership, and then apply it. Because if we don't apply it, it does us no good. And so we're going to start in the next session talking about this definition of leadership. Now, how do you influence people? How do you enlist them? How do you engage them? And the Bible has a lot to say about that, folks. A lot to say about that. So that's what we're going to start in tomorrow. So or in our next session. So we'll leave off here, let you think about some of the things that you've heard. Would encourage you to think through this definition of leadership, what it means, that it is a process, has a beginning and an end, that it is over a period of time, and it's for achieving identifiable results. So we'll stop there.